Welcome. Welcome from wherever you are joining us. Very excited to have you all with us. My name is Sophie Javers. I manage global engagement for the Markets Risk and Resilience Innovation Lab. We are a USAID funded research consortium that is part of the bipartisan Feed the Future initiative. This is the first in a series of webinars that is building off of, so the webinars are called Behavioral Economics and Beyond. So we're looking at insights to improve programming for rural development. And this series builds off of a 2-day forum that we held back in February of this year in DC. On behavioral economics related topics as well. And we received such wonderful feedback and interest from the topics that we covered in the conversations that we had that we wanted to continue those conversations forward through this series of webinars. So we do have the one today, plus another one on November 7th, and then we'll have a third on January 23rd in the new year. So we're really excited to get this going. We have 3 great speakers to share with you today. The first is Mo Alloush. He's an assistant professor of economics at Hamilton College. And he will set the stage by presenting his research from South Africa that shows the interactions between depression and income, which can create a specific kind of vulnerability and particularly pernicious of poverty trap. These findings imply that within poor population, we might expect to see a subgroup of chronically poor people who are trapped by both low income status and poor mental health. We'll then pop over to Michael Carter, who is the director of our MRR Innovation Lab and a distinguished professor of agricultural and resource economics at the University of California in Davis. And he will discuss data from his work in Kenya that shows participants with poor initial mental health did not benefit from a particularly successful asset transfer and graduation program. So that'll be kind of our middle and our transition case study. And then our last speaker will be Andrés Moya, who's an assistant professor of economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. And his presentation will build off this groundwork in 2 ways. He'll present data from the humanitarian context. So in Colombia, where the population has been exposed to significant conflict and violence, he looks specifically at the effect of trauma on the parent-child relationship and how it may threaten child development and the intergenerational transfer of poverty. And then secondly, he'll test intervention that improves mental health with an eye towards improving future economic outcomes. So that will be the grounding of our research today, or of our presentations today. Just quickly, a few protocols. I have everyone, if this is a webinar, so I have everyone currently muted. I would like to invite people to introduce themselves in the chat. And then we also have a Q&A. That would be the preference for where you can put your questions. We should have a robust amount of time at the end of the session to handle those questions that we'll be looking through as they come in. So please just pop them in the Q&A box. We are recording this session, so it will be available as a resource to those that would like to revisit this or to share with colleagues afterwards. And I will offer the opportunity for the attendees to unmute during the Q&A session so that if people prefer to not just type, but actually ask their questions live, that will be an option as well. But we do ask that you hold your questions to the end after the presentations. So first, I'd like to ask Catherine Stahlberg, who is a senior risk advisor at USAID, as part of the Resilience, Environment and Food Security Bureau, and she is also the AOR of our innovation lab. Catherine, if you'd like to give a few words of welcome, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you so much for all your hard work preparing us for this session today. welcome USA colleagues, implementing partners, researchers. We're just really delighted that you're taking this hour out of your day to learn from the MR Lab. The lab has been in place since 2019, and they've done many exciting projects across the world. And so this webinar series is an opportunity for us to learn from the great findings and hopefully apply it in our work to have greater impact at scale for the populations we aim to serve. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Mo and take us away. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. All right, let me share my screen and get going. So I assume this is here for everyone to see. In full screen, everyone can see that?
Looks perfect to me, Mo. Thank you.
All right, great. All right. So thank you for inviting me to give this talk to sort of start us off. I feel like I keep coming back to this research, which is the research that inspired a research program of mine. This is what I started with many years ago. I was recently kind of made aware that the first draft of this was like in 2016. So it's been a while, but so today, as Sophie mentioned, I'll talk about the relationship between income or sort of poverty and psychological well-being and how that affects poverty dynamics. And sort of trying to think about how I started looking at this back in the day during my graduate work. I started by thinking about the relationship, sort of how, what relationship exists between economic and psychological well-being. And so at the time, there's actually a few papers that had started to look at what is the effect of poverty itself on psychological well-being. And there wasn't a lot of work. I think it's kind of proliferated after, but this is kind of the work that was there then. So they're trying to look at the effect of economic well-being and the conditions of poverty and how they can affect psychological well-being and affect mental health outcomes. But I was also interested in this. There was research in psychology and in other places about sort of the other relationship. Okay, so what is the effect of mental health and psychological well-being on economic well-being, right? So, and sort of what are the mechanisms through maybe low levels of psychological well-being can affect a person and a household's economic well-being. And so, as is suggested by this figure, you know, a strong feedback loop between the two can really affect poverty dynamics. Now, this feedback loop for all, putting our econometrics hat on makes actually sort of figuring out the causal relationship kind of hard, but it could really be, it makes the question and this relationship even more interesting because it can affect poverty dynamics. So what I did in this work is show that there are actually causal effects in both directions, kind of confirming what some other research has done, but I've tried to estimate them together in a specific way. And I do find, in terms of how it affects poverty dynamics, is that this relationship, the interconnectedness between economic and psychological well-being can really have an impact on the long run effect of shocks, making them sort of worse and increase the likelihood of long-term poverty. And so that's kind of summarizes a little bit of the research. So why was I interested in psychological well-being? As all of us are quite aware of, they're fairly common worldwide, right? So they're ubiquitous, they're around us. We know people who are suffering from them. So approximately 1 in 5 adults worldwide suffer from some form of psychological disorder, and it does account for a decent amount of the global disease burden, about 13% in some estimates. Specifically, in my research, I focus on depression. It is the most common psychological disorder. There's kind of a relatively high cross-sectional prevalence, about, somewhere between 4 to 5% of people are estimated to suffer from depression at any given time, and sort of higher lifetime prevalence. So people are exposed or experience depression at some point in their life. Depression is, something we care about because it is an important outcome in itself. It has diminished quality of life, increased mortality in extreme cases, From an economics point of view, though, it is also associated with significant impairment in sort of occupational and social roles, which can affect people's sort of ability to engage in their sort of occupation in ways that are that can affect their poverty dynamics. So it there's a lot more work on this now in economics, but it's not very well studied, partially because it's kind of hard to work in this space, especially when it comes to psychological well-being. Sort of trying to do RCTs is quite difficult. There is this reverse causality that the feedback loop I highlighted with the feedback loop at the beginning, but also for a long time there was a lack of data, right? Especially at the individual level, to sort of not a lot of data about mental health at the individual level. Uh, However, as I've mentioned, this relationship is important because it explains some things as development economists that we care about, such as the persistence of poverty and low resilience. And perhaps sort of thinking about a positive note, could help explain some of the large impacts of some programs that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years. All right, so what do I do in my study? I use data from South Africa, a really neat panel data set from South Africa. It follows the same households and individuals over time. It's a national income dynamic study. The neat thing about the study, other than it being a very rich data set, is that it has a psychological well-being module. Specifically, it has the CASD depression scale. This is a widely used depression scale. It sort of assesses depressive symptoms, and it tries to screen for depression in the general population. And it's been validated for use in many different countries around the world, and specifically in South Africa, which is important in this specific context. So here I quickly show you sort of the CSD gives you a score between, at least this version gives you a score between 0 and 30. High numbers are sort of giving you more depressive symptoms. So if people have high numbers on this CSD score, they're exhibiting more depressive symptoms. And so I kind of mentioned that this is used to screen for depression. Typically, any score above 10 is used to identify people who are at risk of being clinically depressed. And so that's sort of the darker part of this distribution of CSD scores in South Africa between 2008 and 2014. So sort of my main sort of initial motivating figure is, well, do poor people in South Africa exhibit more depressive symptoms than others, right? And so here I show sort of the share of people who have a high score above 10, 11, or 12. So those are different thresholds that show, a different amount of risk to being clinically depressed. And at least to start, by wealth, we can see that the poor exhibit significantly higher rates of people having scores above 10, 11, or 12. The number between, the difference between the lowest wealth deciles and the highest is about halved, right? So, among the poorest in South Africa, they have about twice as much risk of having a high score on their depression scale than do the poorest. So at least here, this figure is kind of suggestive of some relationship between income and economic well-being and psychological well-being. All right, so what I do, and I'm going to gloss over like the methods that I use. There's sort of a lot of econometrics that take advantage of the panel nature of the data, the fact that we observe people over time, and I'm able to sort of estimate the relationships, this relationship between income and psychological well-being as a sort of simultaneous, right? So they're both affecting each other at the same time, and sort of thinking about it also from a dynamic point of view, that we're able to look at how this progresses over time. And so the first side of this equation, I try to look at the effect of household income on psychological well-being. And in my data set, I estimate that a 20% sort of increase in household income, decrease in household income decreases psychological well-being, so increases depressive symptoms by about 0.1 standard deviations. This is not small. It's about a 6% increase in the likelihood of depression or of having a score that it's sort of at risk, that we consider at risk of depression. So I do some sort of differentiation by wealth, and I find that the effect of income on psychological well-being is actually is strongest for the poorest, say 2/3 or half of the population in South Africa. So the estimated effect is still negative for the rich, but it's not statistically different from zero. But among the bottom sort of 6 wealth deciles, this effect is quite strong and pronounced. So changes in income among the poor really do have an effect on psychological well-being. And so I turn to the opposite relationship. So I'm gonna skip that. And so I turn to the opposite side of the equation, right? So what effect does psychological well-being have on a person's own individual income? And so what I find is that on average, there is a fairly strong effect of psychological well-being on individual income, but I wanted to investigate a similar sort of non-linearity, right? So I talk about this, threshold of 10 as being kind of important in telling us about risk for depression. So when people have a score above 10, that means they're at risk of having depression. And so I wanted to see is a change from, a score of 1 to 5 has the same effect on your income as a change from 8 to 12, right? So, 1 to 5, you're experiencing more depressive symptoms, but at least in terms of screening for depression, you're not really at risk to having like clinical depression. Whereas going from 8 to 12 is a similar change, right, of depressive symptoms, or at least in number value, but there's a significant increase in the risk that you are clinically diagnosed as depressed. And so those changes might have different effects on your own income. And so I do find a similar sort of result, or parallel to what I showed earlier, is that not all changes in psychological well-being are the same. For people who are closer to that depression threshold, increases in depressive symptoms actually have a more sort of defined and statistically significant effect on income. So they decrease. So increases in depressive symptoms closer to that threshold have a statistically significant effect in decreasing an individual's own income. All right, so just to kind of give a number to that, what I find is that close to that depression threshold, a 1 standard deviation decrease in psychological well-being or increase in depressive symptoms decreases individual income by about 17%. And in the paper, I try to investigate some of the mechanisms, and I find sort of decrease in labor market participation and hours worked as well. All right, so what I do kind of in this paper, I try to bring them all together, right? So I've estimated the effect on each other, but also how these change over time together. And so I try to simulate a little bit the effect on poverty in the long run. So in this here, what I do is I just show a baseline where I kind of take away the effect of the relationship between psychological well-being and income. So, and I just sort of look at poverty dynamics over time. So if psychological well-being, which here I measure on the x-axis, on the y-axis, on the vertical axis right here, has no effect on income, then your poverty in the long run really just depends on where you start with your income at the beginning, right? So if you start with really low income, you're more likely to be poor in the long run, but your depressive symptoms play no role in determining where you are in poverty. So this is kind of a baseline where we ignore ignore this effect, the relationship between psychological well-being and income. But if we do add the psychological well-being into the equation, and I use these results that I've estimated, what I find is that, people who start, person A and person B, who start with very similar levels of income in the baseline, but person A actually has worse psychological well-being, so they have more depressive symptoms in this case, they're significantly more likely to be poor in the long run. So that, this red versus blue, they're about 0.3, so about 30 percentage points more likely to be poor in the long run when we do take into account how psychological well-being and income kind of interact dynamically over time. And so this is kind of a summary of sort of identifying people who are really close, are much more likely to be affected, right? So what this kind of identifies, as Sophie summarized at the beginning, is that the poor with low levels of psychological well-being are kind of experiencing this sort of double difficulty, right? So they are poor to start, but they also have low levels of psychological well-being, making it even more difficult to get out of poverty in the long run. So just to sort of conclude, my work has shown both relationships, right? So the effect of psychological well-being on individual income, the effect of individual income on psychological well-being, and kind of how they interact. And they seem to have implications for poverty dynamics, both in terms of increasing the likelihood of poverty, but also in work that I didn't show today. I show that when a household or an individual experiences shock, this relationship actually makes the shock even more pronounced because it can affect the psychological well-being as well. So in terms of policy implications, I'm going to sort of not say anything because Michael and Andreas will talk a little bit more about that going forward. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mo. And I think, Sophie, the protocol is I move straight away. Is that correct?
Yep, go ahead, Michael, please. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is, as Sophie suggested earlier, is pick up on what Mo has told us and sort of push us in the direction of thinking about how this kind of information may influence what we do and how we program, particularly if we're interested in programs that are directed at fundamentally poor individuals. So Mo's work, for example, suggests that if we were to go into any population, we would expect to find that a disproportionately large number of chronically poor people are trapped not only by their economic status, but also by their mental health and well-being status. The graph to the left comes from a population in northern Kenya, which I'll talk about, an intervention that was oriented towards the women in the picture I just showed. And it's a similar histogram to what Mo showed us, not to get lost in the distribution, but basically the fraction of people in this poor population. And when I say poor population, I mean they're actually eligible for the intervention I'll discuss briefly in just a moment. But the fraction of the population that is likely depressed is roughly double what you would expect to see in a typical global population, or certainly one in the US where we have a lot of data. So this is sort of what the world gives us, if you will. And I think Mo has really nailed down that the grinding processes of poverty and mental health, unfortunately, can put people in a downward spiral. So if we're asking ourselves, how do we intervene for this kind of population, I think we need to take this into account. So I'm going to focus on what's called a graduation program. It's a multifaceted program that addresses the poverty of poor individuals by both improving their skills, to some extent building up their confidence, and also transferring business assets and trying to put them on a productive pathway out of poverty. These kinds of programs, and I suspect most of us on this call are familiar with them, have actually shown incredibly impressive impacts and their average impacts. And the question I want to leave with us here first is, do the average impacts of these of these interventions really tell the full story. So I've always liked to quote Tolstoy, who makes the comment that happy families are all alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So I think what Mo's work is sort of pointing to us is there could be a deep heterogeneity in the types of people we find in unhappy economic circumstances. And so ultimately, the question I think that's challenge to all of us, can we improve poverty reduction programs by accounting for the multiple ways in which a family might be economically unhappy? So this is actually not a trivial point, and it's not related only to the study in northern Kenya I'm going to talk about. I'm going to not go into the graph on the left, but this comes from a very well appreciated and important study of a poverty graduation program in South Asia. And basically, this is a program that shows very high average impacts on the individuals who benefited from it. But it actually also shows that about 30 to 35 to almost 40% of the population who was treated actually got no benefits whatsoever from the program. And that's kind of a chilling reminder that averages are important, but they don't tell the full story. So we see in this picture that some people, roughly, let's call it 65% of the population, actually got large and positive benefits, some very positive benefits, but about a third of the population got no benefits whatsoever. And the question is why? What's going on here? Why are these kinds of programs that are so effective on average, why are they so ineffective for a not inconsequential part of the population that the programs are intended to benefit? And finally, and more importantly, why does that exist, and what can be done to improve the efficacy? So let me just very quickly sort of substantiate what this sort of means on the ground. So I'll just very quickly summarize some work that the MRR lab undertook with an NGO called the BOMA Project in the pastoralist regions of northern Kenya. The BOMA Project runs a fairly standard graduation program in a very difficult economic environment in these pastoralist regions. The program targets women who are chronically poor, and like a standard graduation program, it transfers assets to women and also provides them mentoring and skills trainings over time. So that's the program. And what we were interested in is what's the impact of this kind of program? So if you focus first on the first bullet point here, we find that on average, this program has huge impacts on the women it targets. So on average, the program increases women's business assets by 324%. It increases family cash earnings by about 30%. So those are huge bumps. And it also has a 500% increase in women's savings. So you go, wow, that's really quite amazing. If we look at the program from benefit cost perspective, it's highly cost effective. The benefit cost ratio is about $2.50 a benefit for every dollar in full program spending. So we can feel really good about this program. At the same time, if we break it down and we say, well, as I already showed you, we know that the population that this program treated is split between individuals who are at risk of severe depressive symptoms that is likely to interfere with their economic activity, and those who are not. If we estimate those things separately, what we see is that for the non-depressed population, the benefits are 10 to 20% higher for the non-depressed population than those very impressive average impacts I just talked about. So in other words, on assets for the non-depressed people, the increase is not 324%, it's about 20% higher. So let's call that about 380%. And for income, it's even larger. It's about a quarter higher. So that means for the non-depressed populations, people are earning not just a 32% increase, but about another 25%. So let's call that about 40%. On the other hand, the blue bars here are showing relative to the average impacts, the impact on the 20% or so of the population that is at risk of severe psychological depression. And again, I should stress this is depression or depressive symptoms as measured by a baseline use that is pre-intervention psychological well-being of households measured before the intervention using the CESD score that Mo told us about. And again, what we see here is the impact on women's assets is substantially smaller for the depressed population. They're essentially drawing down the assets that were transferred to them. There's actually no positive impact on family income. If anything, while it's not statistically different from zero, the estimated impact on family income is actually negative, suggesting that the women who had depressive symptoms, they received assets, they sort of lived off the assets, and their earned income may have actually decreased. The impact on savings is not very pronounced, and probably reflects the nature of the social pressures that the savings groups do. So in summary, what we see is that when we think about addressing a chronically poor population, we need to take into account that there's heterogeneity. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, and one size fits all programming may not be adequate, may not be up to really addressing the poverty of all these people. So what I'd like to do on that sort of depressing note, if you will, let me pass it over now to Andrés Moya, who can tell us a little bit more about some of the work he's been doing, where they proactively attempt to address the psychological problems that are experienced by many poor people. So Andrés, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank everybody for being here and for inviting me. Let me share my screen. Are you seeing this appropriately?
We're seeing you with your notes.
Okay,
That's good. Yep, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. So let me, I think, just to make the connection, I think what Michael and Mo were highlighting is the interplay between psychological and the standard socioeconomic constraints, and how we need to think about this more thoroughly, because as Michael was suggesting, one-size-fits-all programs may not work. And I think the main message is that we need to consider thoroughly the effects of mental health on these dimensions, both as an outcome, but also as this pathway that might affect other dimensions that might keep people trapped in poverty. But let me just zoom in a little bit of what happens in humanitarian context of conflict, displacement, and forced migration, which is where I work. And I think this is particularly important here for many reasons. One is we were witnessing the increase of displacement conflict worldwide. Right now, there's 2 billion people living in conflict settings, more than 115 million that have been displaced, and we're seeing it in the news, right? Unfortunately, it's happening in Lebanon, it's happening in Gaza, it's happening in Ukraine, it's happening in South Sudan, it's also happening in Latin America, to mention some cases. And what we know from a large body of work is that this is going to have long-lasting consequences in terms of chronic poverty, because it's going to increase socioeconomic vulnerability, but also it's going to affect two dimensions that we sort of have missed for many years, and that we're just starting to pay attention or pay more attention to, which is mental health and early child development. And this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be focusing in Colombia, and I'm just going to highlight that Colombia is interesting beyond me being Colombian. It's interesting for many reasons. One is we've suffered with decades of conflict, protracted conflict, displacement. The map on your right is displaying the intensity of displacement across Colombian municipalities, and it's highlighting the pervasiveness of conflict and displacement. In addition, we actually host 20% of the Colombian population is actually displaced. This includes IDPs, Colombians who have been internally displaced, but also Venezuelan refugees. And it's also interesting because Colombia has set in place very progressive and comprehensive policy and legal frameworks to protect IDPs for 30 years now, and also progressive policies to protect Venezuelan refugees who have been arriving since 2016. And despite this, what we see is the persistence of poverty among both populations. For IDPs, for instance, for whom we have data, 60% of IDPs are currently poor. And this is despite these very generous and comprehensive policies. And part of the message, and I think connecting with what Michael and Mo were discussing, is that we've missed the importance of mental health as an outcome, and how it is also going to affect these socioeconomic trajectories. In Colombia, 27 and 35% of IDPs are at risk of developing anxiety and depression. The figure on your right, on your left is displaying what the psychologists talk about as the dose-response relationship. And this is highlighting that populations that have been more severely affected by conflict in this case are going to experience more and more symptoms of anxiety. And what we know, and connecting with the work that I did previously, we know that this mental health problems are going to affect different domains of socioeconomic trajectories and economic behavior. For instance, they're going to make people more risk averse. They're going to make it more hopeless about their possibility of upward socioeconomic mobility. And they also have effects on employment and income trajectories. But what I want to focus right now is to think about what's happening with young children who are born in these conflict-affected settings. And this is important because children are overrepresented in terms of the numbers of IDPs and refugees in Colombia and worldwide. And we know that early childhood is a unique and the most amazing stage in our life. It's a moment of rapid brain development. There's in any second, there's 1 million new synapses, new neural connections. This lays out the foundations for physical and mental health. It lays out the foundations for cognitive and social-emotional skill acquisition. It lays the foundation for future socioeconomic trajectories. But at the same time, early childhood is the period that's most sensitive to stress and adversities. The figure on your right is highlighting the density of the neural connections in a normal child, and a child that's exposed to normal environments, and one that's exposed to severe and persistent adversities that actually increase the likelihood of developing toxic stress. So toxic stress is the overactivation of different biological systems in response to these severe adversities. And what you can see is that the density of these neural connections is actually much lower for those children who are exposed to toxic stress. And the strength of the neural connections, it's also weaker in these settings. And so this is important because at a very early age, these children are going to be put into a different socioeconomic trajectory. And so this is just highlighting the mechanism, the underlying mechanism of the persistence of poverty and trauma across time and across generations. And what we know, although more and more programs are starting and more initiatives are starting to pay attention to what's happening with children in these settings, there's a missing link. And in these projects and policies, largely we have ignored the importance of caregivers' mental health. Because again, more severe conflict, more like a higher exposure to adversities, it's not only going to affect children, it's not only going to affect the likelihood of developing toxic stress with all the negative effects that this can have, but it's also affecting caregivers. And what I'm plotting here is the distributions and the quality of the child-caregiver relationship, the stress in the child-caregiver relationship, and also children's mental health. And this is for children between 2 and 5 years of age. And what we can see here, the black line is portraying those caregivers who had who were at risk of developing mental health problems at the baseline of our impact evaluation that I'm going to be talking about in a few seconds. And so what this is highlighting that those caregivers who had at-risk symptoms of mental health, then they have more stressful relationship with their children. They have a lower capacity of connecting and providing sensitive and nurturing care to their children. And then this maps out into their children's mental health and children's development. And again, this is just highlighting the root and the persistence of poverty and inequality and mental health problems across time and across generations. So again, I think the main message here is that we've ignored how mental health is affecting all these dimensions with very serious consequences, not only in the current in the present tense, but also across time. But then to maybe switch and provide a little bit of hope, we can show that it is actually feasible to break this intergenerational transmission of trauma and poverty. And for the past 10 years, we partnered with psychologists at the University of California, San Francisco, And we designed this program called Semillas de Apego, which translates as seeds for attachment or seeds for healthy attachment. And Semillas de Apego is a psychosocial program for caregivers of young children who are living in conflict-affected settings. We started working 10 years ago with IDPs. Then we opened the box a little bit to reach other conflict-affected populations. And since the past 4 years, we've been working also with Venezuelan refugees. And the objective of the program is to precisely recognize this missing link that I was talking about. So we want to promote maternal mental health and caregiver mental health as an outcome by itself, as an important outcome by itself, but it's also a vehicle that it's going to allow us to improve the quality of the child-caregiver relationships. And through that, we're going to be able to buffer the effects of toxic stress and promote early child development. It's conducted in a group setting, so 15 to 20 caregivers meet once per week for 15 weeks. And it's based on a community delivery model led by community facilitators who are non-professionals, but who we train and support throughout the program. This is just to highlight that we have been conducting the program in different phases, including an impact evaluation in Tumaco, Colombia. This is the municipality in southwest of Colombia, on the border with Ecuador and the Pacific coast of Colombia. Geographically rich. Culturally, it's amazing. It's also one of the places that has been most affected by displacement because it happens to be the place where between 60 to 65% of the drug trade from Colombia is coming out into the Pacific. And in this setting of ongoing conflict, we worked with 1,400 caregivers who were extremely vulnerable. So 82% have been direct victims of violence, 57% have been internally displaced, and they had high levels of mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. And despite this, this challenging setting, over the impact evaluation, we witnessed that the program can actually improve caregiver mental health, the stress and the quality in the child-caregiver relationship, the type of interactions in which caregivers engage with their children, so more positive parenting, less negative type of discipline strategies. And it also brings about sizable and significant improvements in children's mental health and children's development. The figure here is portraying the point estimates of all these 5 effects. And it's actually highlighting that the impacts actually improve over time. So the effects pick up and they become more and more consistent over time. So just to start wrapping, what we're highlighting is that, one, it is important to address this missing link and address the effect of these psychological constraints on many different dimensions, in this case, on early child development. But at the same time, we're highlighting this source of heterogeneity that actually connects with what Michael and Mo were discussing. We find stronger impacts of the program for caregivers who are at risk of mental health problems, and for those who had been displaced and those who had the high levels of victimization. So this is highlighting that it is possible to address the mental health problems among this very vulnerable population. But at the same time, we see smaller impacts for families who are food insecure and who are extremely poor at baseline. And this is, I think this is totally intuitive. This is highlighting that possibly it's very difficult for you as a caregiver who is struggling to bring food into the table to then participate over 15 weeks and be willing to be open about your emotional problems when there's extreme poverty and extreme food insecurity. So this is highlighting, I think, connected with what Michael was mentioning, that we cannot think about a one-size-fits-all type of policy, and maybe we need to think about integrating different type of strategies to be able to address the psychological and socioeconomic constraints at the same time. We're also highlighting that this is cost-effective. Our program is actually cheaper than the similar government program that actually doesn't have evidence of impact. And we're finding a high rate of return for every dollar spent of 370% that actually doesn't even consider the impacts of children that are going to happen across the lifetimes. And it's also a program that, as we've tested in different phases, has the potential to be scaled up. And we're currently scaling up in 15 municipalities to reach 15,000 caregivers. And just to wrap up, I think this is, and I think to wrap up not only my presentation, but also the whole discussion, I think all of our results are speaking to the urgency of considering psychological constraints to promote movements out of poverty. It's important not only to understand that socioeconomic dimensions that are going to affect mental health, but also important, as Mo was mentioning, how there's this feedback loop, right? And that we need more programs that are considering this important dynamics. Mental health at the end underlines many dimensions and processes for human capital and socioeconomic trajectories. And finishing up with the same message that Mo started, the lessons that we're highlighting are not limited to the context of Colombia and crisis and humanitarian crisis. There's rising forced displacement worldwide. There's increasing refugee flows to the global north. But at the end, there's 970 million people globally who are living with mental health problems. Just in 2019. So it's important that we push forward and start considering better mental health and how it interacts with these different domains. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrés. That was really a great way to kind of wrap everything together. Thank you. So we do have about, let's see here, 15 minutes, if anyone wants to stay a little bit beyond the hour, to open up for questions. We're really excited to be able to dig into this a little bit more, have a conversation with those of you in attendance. We do have a couple questions here that have come up. I can start off with one from the Q&A, but please go ahead and feel free to put them in. I can also unmute you if you raise your hand, and you can ask the question live if you'd like. So I have a question here for, I think all of you, though it mentions Michael. It says, Michael notes how impacts for graduation programs might be quite different for those who are particularly depressed. Do you have a sense as to whether we might expect to see similar results in other types of development programs? That could be for all of you or any of you.
Well, why don't I have a go at it? I think it's a great question. I'm going to get a little bit in front of the evidence. I think the most honest answer is I think we all know that some programs don't seem to work for some people. And we started the work that I mentioned in part because it became quite striking that a program that seems like it should help everybody actually was not. And the question became why. And my guess is we have similar phenomena. The only strong piece of evidence that comes to mind immediately was a project that we were doing on improved seed varieties in Mozambique. So really very, very different kind of intervention. And as a small part of the project, information on people's psychological well-being was captured. And it turns out when we looked at the data, the individuals in treatment, in quotes, communities who were being offered the opportunity to learn about new agricultural technology, the people in the weakest psychological circumstances didn't even go to the meetings where the technology was discussed and presented. And that's like really, it's sort of, you say, well, okay, that's what it means to be depressed or to have no sense of agency. And yet, if you think about it, that means these individuals were cut off at the very, very beginning from even taking that first step, which perhaps could have made it. It was actually a very efficacious technology. So I think it's a great question. I think we probably haven't looked enough to really start to find. And yet, just to say one other thing, I think addressing these issues is important because, the work with BOMA, just to use it as an example, it's amazing work that they've been able to do, an amazing rate of return. I sort of did a back of the envelope calculation and I said, you have a $2.20 benefit cost ratio or 220% return on investment, to use the metric that Andrés used. If you just had not treated the depressed people, your return on investment would have been 330%. And they go, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to overlook those people. And I said, that's right, but you need to think about addressing those people where they are. And I think more generally, we need to start thinking about these things. And this evidence across all of our presentations, I think, stresses the need to do that.
And if I can jump in, Michael, and add a different example of the Colombian government has vocational programs in general, and these are very popular in Latin America, although with very limited impact. But as part of the victims law and the policies to support victims, the Colombian government then designed specific vocational programs for victims. And the idea, starting to consider the different characteristics, was, well, we also need to try to promote some of these preferences and social-emotional skills, so grit, perseverance, and so on. And so we came in, we wanted, and this is what the project with IDB, we wanted to run an impact evaluation. At the end, this didn't happen. But what we were finding is that those victims, so these are young victims between 18 to 25 years of age, who had PTSD symptoms at baseline, were less likely to attend, were less likely to graduate. And over 2 years, where we could actually follow them with admin data, they had lower levels of employment and lower levels of income. So this is just highlighting, I think, as the question was presented, that there's other evidence coming out on how these psychological constraints are actually affecting behavior and actually affecting the impact of otherwise maybe successful policies. And this is unfortunate because at the end we came with these conclusions to the Ministry of Labor, who was running the program, and the Ministry of Labor were like, this is actually not a problem. We're the Ministry of Labor, not the Ministry of Health. Right, but we need to push this forward.
Great, thank you, Andres. Wei, we have a question from you. Please go ahead.
Actually, it's rather a suggestion. Thank you very much for the fellow researchers. I'm also a behavior economist. I'm working for USAID. Recently, actually, I was in Mozambique doing a research on unconditional cash transfer. Michael, I was thinking that your research is so brilliant. I think there's probably one middle link. If you can establish, then maybe you'll be able to establish the connection between psychological studies and economic decision or choice. What if the research scope allows, try to elicit the people's social preference parameters, trying to see that how they react to unfair treatment, that would be the unfairness concern, maybe using dictator game. And if you use, ultimatum game, if you use dictator game, then maybe you can elicit people's altruistic behavior toward others. I wonder that the people are bothered by depression, they actually just simply just retreat themselves into the corner of their little universe, refuse to connect with others with a lot of mistrust and distrust, and that actually and then just reduce their opportunity to participate in economic, especially collective actions. So I will follow up follow your research, and then everybody's Mo and Andres. Thank you very much for your research. I took down your name, so I will look at it. Maybe in the future we can discuss more about this. But please think about that. Certainly, psychological studies affect a person's interaction with others, and that's including everything: social, cultural, especially economical, investment behavior, saving behavior, cooperation behavior. There's just so much you can unpack. Thank you for the brilliant presentation. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sophie, do we have more questions online?
You're muted.
Oh, there we go. We have a quick question around if anyone has looked at, maybe this goes to Andreas, have you looked at PTSD specifically, and whether over time the depression and anxiety declined the farther away from that instance of trauma passed, or whether, is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, we actually, the example that I was portraying on the vocational program was actually based on PTSD data. But then over time, we started recognizing that PTSD is not the best construct, because these are overlapping and vulnerabilities. And actually in Colombia, you might be exposed to conflict, being displaced, but then you come into other conflict affected settings. So now we work with more like complex trauma, concurrent trauma, and then thinking about the whole dimensions of mental health problems, and not only anxiety and depression, but then other symptoms of mental health problems beyond PTSD, which is actually, again, it's post-trauma, right? And the evidence that we're seeing is that depending on the quality of the programs, you could see that people and participants and recipients can actually be better able to navigate these challenges of living in these very adverse circumstances, right? So you're not eliminating, unfortunately, the stressors, but people do become better able to recognize that mental health is a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances, and to be better able to regulate these emotions. And this is what then explains the sort of the sequence of effects in terms of the quality of the relationships, and then what's happening with children.
Great, thank you, Andrés. So a quick question, if considering kind of sex disaggregated data is becoming more and more the norm, are you anticipating, or would you recommend that kind of mental health disaggregated data also become the norm based on the research that you've been doing in terms of, Michael, you mentioned averages just aren't good enough in terms of really understanding the impacts of a program. So how do we get, if we're looking at an audience of donors and of implementing partners, how do we overcome that hurdle of getting past the average impacts and getting into the nitty-gritty? What would you suggest?
Yeah. So sure, and I mean, I'll let Mo say a word on this as well in terms of individually disaggregated information. I think in general it matters a lot. I think in the work that I highlighted, we focused specifically on the women who were the intended beneficiaries of a particular program, because they were sort of the active agents that we were interested in. I mean, if you think about broader population surveys, I know the World Bank, for example, right now is rethinking their longitudinal studies, their so-called LSMS surveys, and they're not focused on a target population, but then for something as specific as mental health, if it's not in, there's no such thing as mental health of the household, right? There's the mental health of the people in the household. So I think we need to think about that. And Mo, in the South Africa study, did the NIDS data actually cover all individuals in the household, or how was that actually done?
Yeah, it did. Every adult or 16 and over were asked to fill out to answer the CSD questionnaire. So yeah. In terms of sort of gendered results, like in South Africa, I did at some point try to differentiate between sort of how this relationship, if the relationship is there or is different for men and women, and the results were not statistically different from each other. Like both relationships existed among both. Perhaps some of the estimates were a little bit bigger for one versus the other, but they were both there and not really different enough to affect the overall sort of picture and dynamics.
Great, thank you. So we've reached the hour. Are there any kind of final thoughts that any of the three of you would like to add as we kind of leave our attendees? And I'll also tease our next webinar. Okay, so if there's no more, go ahead, Michael, please.
I will say one word. I mean, and Catherine's here with us, so I think all of us here have benefited in one way or the other from the resources to the innovation labs, and we work hard on what we do, but we feel best when we communicate with people who can do something with the information that we share. So we're here. You can reach out to us directly. You can go through Catherine. And I think as the questions revealed, there's a lot more to be done in terms of making programs more effective. So we're always ready to engage in that kind of positive conversation. So Catherine, did you want to say anything further?
Yeah, exactly. Well, just mostly thank you, Michael and team at UC Davis. The MR Lab is doing incredible work, and this is a wonderful opportunity to share that with partners, USA colleagues. And I just encourage everybody, follow up. My email is kstallberg@usa.gov. Please get in touch if you'd like to get connected with Michael and team. They are eager to share their findings so that we can do even better work in the field. So thanks everybody for taking the time. Thank you, especially Sophie, for all your hard work to set this up for today.
So
and thank you, presenters. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
And if you did enjoy the webinar, find it useful, actually, I have a quick poll I can launch for those who are still hanging on to it. And we have November 7th at this same time, our second of our webinars, Enabling Tech Adoption Through Learning. And this will be kind of moving beyond behavioral economics a little bit and looking at kind of possible behavioral constraints to learning. How do we promote the adoption of new agricultural technologies through perhaps taking advantage of things like spillover effects or kind of learning by doing? So hopefully that will also sound interesting to you. I saw in the chat that someone was already asking about kind of spillover effects. So if you are interested, please do register for the second webinar. That information will be soon coming on our website, basis.ucdavis.edu. So thank you very much, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Sophie.
Have a great day. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Bye, Andres. Thank you. Thanks, Mo.
Bye.
Bye.